Hello, I'm Rachel and I'm recording this video in response to the question, how would you describe in your own words your mental health problem or experiences of distress? So I would say that I had a breakdown during my final year at university, but I've struggled with various kinds of mental health problems since I was probably about 14. My most problematic symptom, I guess, is self-harm, which was also the kind of earliest symptom to develop. I get very anxious and I do get quite low, but yeah, self-harm and eating issues of various kinds tend to be the way that manifests itself. And I do feel suicidal a lot, and I do act on that sometimes. And that escalation to that point really started when I was in my last year at university. So I was 6 months from finals, and there was just quite a combination of factors that just became too much. And I ended up attempting suicide a couple of times, at which point I thought, maybe this isn't really the time to be doing finals, and went home. Initially that was just going to be a year, and then I was going to go back, and then that became 2 years, and then it became clear that it just wasn't going to happen. I wasn't going to finish my degree. So that was 3.5 years ago that I left university now, that I had that breakdown. And during that time, I've been in and out of crisis periods quite a lot. So by crisis, I mean that my suicidal thoughts become really intense, to the point where I can't really manage them safely on my own at home, and have to go into residential treatment or inpatient treatment on a ward. That used to be more or less constant, but now it tends to be, I get gaps of maybe a few months between crises. So yeah, that is my experience. So to talk about diagnosis, I've got this DIY, here's one I made earlier, teaching aid, which, I'll just show it to the camera. It's diagnosis bingo. So my diagnosis is borderline personality disorder, which is quite a controversial diagnosis, and I have really mixed feelings about it. On one level, it is really not a lot of fun. It is an insulting label to be given, and I do feel like it's gendered. Most people who are given borderline personality disorder as a diagnosis are women, and I do feel that, like 100 years ago, they would have said we were hysterical, and now they just say we've got a personality disorder. And there are large parts of the symptoms that I don't necessarily relate to. Like, I'm not massively impulsive in areas other than binge eating. I don't have psychotic episodes at all, that kind of thing. But there are parts of it that I relate to. I do struggle to identify and regulate my emotions. I do feel quite empty a lot of the time. I do have quite sudden mood changes. So I can see aspects of it that I do relate to. And also, just on a practical level, it was the only way that I was going to get any support, because where I live, there is a specialist personality disorder service. It was the only way I was going to get any kind of long-term therapy. It got me access to 2 years of dialectical behaviour therapy, though after a long wait, but that's a whole other video. So actually, when I was given the diagnosis, it was about a year after I'd left university, and I'd been in and out of crisis all of that time. And so actually I was just really relieved when someone said, this is the label you need to get help, this is the label we're giving you. So I thought, oh, okay, I don't have to manage this on my own anymore. And I also think rightly or wrongly, it's kind of seen as more severe than some other diagnoses, because you generally have to have been floating around in the system for a while before you get given it. It tends to be the box they put you in after they've run out of other boxes. And I think that in terms of getting support, like disability benefits, and I'm going back to university now and applying for disabled students allowance, I think things like that, actually it is easier with a diagnosis of personality disorder than it would be if I had the same degree of severity, but my diagnosis was something where there's a much broader range of degrees to which people struggle, like depression and anxiety. It's such a huge spectrum. I think it's quite difficult to get taken seriously where the diagnosis is quite generic. So I essentially see it as a means to an end, and I will describe myself as having borderline personality disorder in some circumstances, but not always. But I have also found it quite painful sometimes, because I do think that sometimes a diagnosis like that can be used to pathologise quite normal human reactions to things. Like, for instance, when I went onto a ward and I was put in a situation that was, wards are very stressful places, and nobody was really explaining to me what was happening. Nobody was explaining anything that I needed to know, and I was really, really distressed. And I felt like, because I was a patient with a diagnosis of borderline personality disorder, that distress was interpreted as me having an extreme emotional reaction, because that's what people with BPD do, rather than I was having an extreme emotional reaction because I was actually in quite an extreme situation where anybody would be really frightened and potentially quite angry because you're locked in. So I think there are pros and cons to diagnosis and to that particular diagnosis. At the end of the day, it was a means to the end of getting the help that I needed.